She's back. Hi, Dr. Eleanor.
Hi, Nameh.
How are you, sweetheart?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm so good. I'm so good. It's been, I want to shower on you a bunch. Being in your classes and experiencing you with Sean on that podcast, seeing your social media. I'm getting more and more books. I didn't tell you this when we were meeting before, but I've got Cosmic Guidance due to arrive today. There's such a wealth of nourishment that is filling my soul up. And I'm so grateful that somehow we've connected, and I'm curious where today's conversation goes. So I'm nourished, I'm thrilled, and I'm grateful.
And I'm grateful as well.
Mm.
Um, your energy has been so supportive
Oh, good.
and such a blessing and such a verification and confirmation that the material is of benefit and is changing lives. And that's why I do what I do,
Yeah.
because there's a need for it.
Well, a small example, I go hiking fairly often, and sometimes similar, we were having a little bit of a conversation that we were like, pause, let's bring it to this recorded moment about downloads. And I was hiking and I was getting this download, record something, and so I was recording it, and I got to this moment and I found my hips doing the figure eights. Oh, look at that. Like I couldn't tell my brain to do it, and my body started doing it. It was really beautiful. And I
The
started,
figure eights are so powerful.
right? Well, I was telling you again before we pressed record that last night I went to this tantric speed dating, and one of the things, it was a really beautiful container of how they facilitated it. And the facilitator said, like, what is it that you're claiming in your life? What is it that you're calling in? And I said, or I want to take the want out of it. I want to claim it. I claim um, nervous system regulation. And
Mm.
I feel like that's part of, you know, working with you, being in your classes. It's it's all of us, all of our worlds. Like my mental is being satisfied and nourished through the questions that you land during class. Yeah. So it's beautiful how the ripple effects of what's coming through.
The when you say you want your nervous system to be nourished, we're talking about the physical biologic body.
Ah,
And so there is a pathway from that physical body to spirit.
right.
And if that spiritual component of your physical being is not fully spiritualized, but is being sort of thrown around by the mental world and the emotional reactivity of this person or that person or whatever, you need to take a step back and go inside and say, where the clean question would be, and what do I know about my nervous system now?
Right.
Because it might be activated unconsciously.
Right.
And unless you can reframe that past activation of it, it doesn't rebalance.
Yep. 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 Well, and that's a thread that maybe for a topic we were maybe going to explore today is the topic of past lives. And so one, I feel there's a number of seeds of conversation that we could go or that might arrive in our time today. And you were naming about the downloads that are coming through and around the physicality or the illnesses in the body. And something that I've been tracking that I had a private conversation with Sean about where I was sharing with him that I'm going to go into some maybe TMI, but I get stinky sweat. I can be cold and I get stinky off gassing something
Mm.
that I can't get out of my clothes. Like it's one of those things. And when I've tracked it, it's linked to a number of past lives where it basically wasn't safe to be myself. And so I'm putting that thread or connecting that dot potentially around what I heard you say around what do I know about this now as opposed to then. So
Also,
yeah,
what do you want to have happen around that as opposed to what happened then?
right. Yeah. Well, and I'm curious if this sparks anything for you around like my body is going through some experience, and maybe this is connected to the download that isn't fully downloaded around because my body's doing the sweating. There's something happening that's getting triggered in the moment.
Yes. And so the question would be whether you can find a common trigger.
Hmm. I know it. Yeah. It's like
So
I'm gonna
there is a common trigger.
yeah, I'm gonna get kicked out of a community. Like I get into a learning space and I'm like, oh my gosh, I am drinking from this well and so nourished. And if I bring up a need or I bring up a conflict or I bring up something that's uncomfortable in my experience, better keep quiet because they'll kick me out. Or I am clear about a past life where somehow I was making this beautiful marble floor and the person who hired me, so when there's bosses involved, and I was violently physically hurt because there was some kind of disconnect. So I can get like nervous system activated within when because we've looked at my chart and I'm so sensitive to frequency, 1858 and 1949. I feel something is uncomfortable and nobody's articulating it, and I feel like I have to silence myself out of perceived maintained safety, whatever quote safety is.
I'm wondering if the trigger for you is the other person's frequency.
Oh, that lens is correct. My body is opening.
And the reason I'm thinking that is you're taking 100% responsibility for your physical reaction, but we also know you're an empath.
Yeah.
So is it your reaction or is it the person in front of you who is so uncomfortable with their feeling that you know there's no room for you to respond because they can't handle it?
Right.
So it's the suppression of the truth in a situation that needs the truth.
And my trajectory of life, I'm 51, teenage years, 20s, 30s, 40s, it was, erupt or be that really, I don't know, puffed up chest reaction to kind of like keep everybody away, keep that frequency away. And I ultimately wanted to be close to people, so it was keeping the people I wanted away as well as that energy. So,
So it's the discernment of whose emotional reactivity state has the possibility for transformation versus who is in a lower frequency and you shouldn't even attempt to go there with them.
so how do you be kind to those people? Because that's ultimately a goal of mine. I don't want to be
You find a way to, let's say it's somebody who's a boss who has said something to you about what you're doing, and it's really hard for them to bring it up. And so you don't feel like you can say to them, what you're asking me to do is fucked up.
right.
Um, what you could do is ask a clean question. When you're asking me to do this, um, what is um, let me get more specific about what you need. So you ask them to be more transparent without you showing your hand.
Hmm.
Does that sound like it could work?
There's
Not
one
in all situations, in some of them.
in some of them, yes, but I think the biggest moment, and I'm actually pinging to what I felt you and Sean talking about in yesterday's, but wait, there's more with Dr. Eleanor, that moment for pause. When you're talking about being in the Bordeaux and, before a being transitions, there's kind of a
Right.
pause moment. It's it's been these years of noticing, so that discernment part of slowing it down. Because it's like my system moves so fast into dysregulation out of perceived lack of safety.
If I recall in your design, you have channels that relate to breathing.
Hmm. Right.
So using your breath,
Yeah.
and I would practice with it
Hmm.
so that when there needs to be a pause, as we move from the side of the tree of life that is the splenic center,
Hmm.
and in the now, in the splenic center, but the emotional reaction is not in the now.
Right.
The emotional reaction's a wave. So you're catching the wave when your physiology is reacting to a dissonance between your frequency and the frequency of the emotion of the other person. Okay. So you can shift your frequency to one that would take the reactivity off you
Hmm.
by intellectual. See, when there's emotional reactivity, it has to move to the emotional matrix,
Right.
which is angelic, and it has the crown and ajna. So you have to move into determining and setting a goal for yourself. Now, if I recall, you also have the capacity to set goals.
I do. And 5027. So there's also that, like, that piece where you named, I wake up knowing that there's a mission, but I don't know what the mission is. When there's that dissonance, I'm like, is this my mission? Is this my mission?
Um, don't worry about your mission.
Hmm.
Trust it when you feel that. The words to say to yourself would be, okay, God,
Hmm.
um, I know there's something for me something you want me to be doing or handling. Um, let me know when the time is right.
Oh, lovely. Yeah,
You just say, okay, I'm ready. Ping me when it's time.
I love that.
Don't take on the burden of knowing
Beautiful.
because you don't know till you know.
Right.
And the knowing is not going to come from the splenic center
Hmm.
alone. It's going to come from when the intellectual recognition pieces together the splenic and the solar plexus.
Hmm.
And so there's a weighting
Yep.
involved.
Yep.
You wake up in the morning, you don't know who you're going to have to help. You don't know when you're going to have to help.
I want the
So
list.
um, you don't have the list for good reason.
Right. Well, as you're speaking about this, I'm thinking about the tantric dating last night. It was a beautiful way of how they do this. The women are deciding whether they want or how they want to engage with the men. And of course, the men can, name if they don't want to in their capacity or in the process. And there was somebody who was articulating basically a really deep need for touch. And I knew for myself that I didn't want to mix my aura with this person. And I had an awareness of like, I may not want to long term with this person. And I think in this moment, I can be that space of touch for 1 minute. So, kind of to your point, I felt like I can do this. I'm not good or open for that. So that's the example that's kind of anchoring what you're speaking to.
But then thinking about the paths, the channels between the root and the solar plexus,
Mhm.
one of them wants limitation, the 3041,
Which I have.
which wants limitation unless you decide you don't.
Huh. Wow. Is this part of the download that you're speaking of that's coming up in a future class?
Not exactly,
Okay.
but you never know. Um, this might be an added piece in the equation. I mean, as I'm working with each path of intelligence, now let's understand the Ross said very clearly that the human design system is a synthesis of the tree of life, but he didn't know the tree of life and he didn't integrate it. As I am working systematically through it for my teaching, it's very clear that the body map and the channels in the body map actually pull the worlds and separate them within the channels themselves. So when we're looking at the flow of energy in the noble energy map, and I'm not talking about human design, because human design is 1/8
Right.
of who we are as a functioning human being. So if we're looking at a human design chart, we're not going to see how any individual can move through the paths of intelligence that delineate the developmental critical periods in psychological process that moves from unconsciousness up the ladder to full actualization. And the tree of life, ancient, dates way before Judaism.
Mm.
And historically, the way the tree of life was disseminated was through Moses
Mm.
and Jewish mysticism. But what Moses did when he brought it to the West
Oh.
and documented it was he did two versions, one with and one without the Hebrew vowels.
Huh.
And the Hebrew vowels add some secret soup to it.
Mm.
So the Jewish mystics kept it secret.
Mhm.
And as I'm going through it, I'm seeing, for example, three channels between the sacral and the root. The tree of life says three channels between the sacral and the root. The tree of life gives one channel between the root and the splenic center, and one channel between the root and the solar plexus. But in the body map, we have 3 between each. And those 3 are the spiritual world, the mental world, and the physical world, but not the emotional world per se. The path between, so those have the emotional world, but they don't include the physical incarnating world, the mental world. So the mental world, when we're dealing with the tree of life, is the real world we live in. But the tree of life is the roadmap back to how we get there fully actualized.
Mhm.
So when you're looking at the tree of life, there's not a one-on-one correspondence to the body graph.
Mm.
And that's where a lot of the human design people got tripped up.
Mm.
And I did too, trying to see, how does the body graph fit into the tree? Well, it doesn't,
Mhm.
because it's the content that we're integrating, not the structure of it that we're integrating.
Mhm.
But as we see that the body graph amplifies it, we can decode it.
Mhm.
And that's what I'm doing.
Wonderful.
So as you move from the initiation that says, before you do anything, wait. Before you make a decision, ask yourself, is this spiritual?
Mhm.
Is this compassionate? Is this loving? So if you're with somebody and you have a lot of open centers in all of your individual designs, so in the normal everyday world, you're like a sponge and you're absorbing all of the stuff from everybody. Well, you have in your splenic center the ability to discern,
Mhm.
is this me or not me?
Mhm.
Is this something I want to deal with, or can I ignore it?
Mhm.
If you need to deal with it, let's say you have a physical reaction, then you need to deal with it. How do you deal with it? You take it in and you breathe. Why do you breathe? Because you have the channels in your integrated design that say, when you have a physical reaction, in order to know if it belongs to you or not, breathe, rebalance, and then you know what you know.
Yeah, the magic of slowing things down and waiting. Is there any version of a chart that doesn't need to slow down?
No, because think about it. We're born, we have a birth chart.
Mhm.
All the 4 prenatal charts are with us when we're born. But then we get a whole other 3 months to develop. And we're still not fully developed.
Right.
So then we're being influenced by the people, and we don't have their charts, but we have your chart.
Yeah.
And we can see when things hook up.
Mhm.
When does the solar plexus hook up? When does the self center hook up? Or do they?
Mhm.
There may be some centers that never hook up, but there may be mostly centers that do hook up. So the timing says everybody needs to wait till they know what they know because they know it.
Right.
That's spirit.
Mhm.
And then just because you know, doesn't mean you blurt it out and bulldoze people. It means then you move into spirit, your higher self, and you ask yourself, what is in the best interest of this person? And is that right for me? Before you act.
Right. I'm getting this image of like, when you're on a plane and you get the like air traffic controllers, it's like in my system. You kind of need, like the yellow light, the green light, yeah, yeah, recoding.
That may be your signals, and that may be whatever works for each person listening in terms of waiting till you know what you know
Yeah,
and not compromising it.
yeah. Something that I had written down as a question, and it's interesting that you're answering it, was to talk about the developmental, like what the different timestamps how those different timestamps can inform or provide nuanced information. And I feel like you're naming that. But if there's more, I'm always interested.
The first 3 months is an interesting one because astrologically, we also date back 3 months to look at progressions.
Hmm.
So we know that looking back in the astrological world, 3 months takes us back to the 3 months of the moon. And astrologers did it because they figured people wouldn't live beyond 90. So they went back 90 days. But in design, that 3 month period marks the time when the baby's cortex of the brain has been developed enough that it's registering what's coming from outside the mother. So if a mother plays music in the third trimester, the baby remembers it. And so a lot of women play music, and then when the baby is born, that music calms them down.
Mhm.
So that mental world 3 month period also postnatally is the period of manifestation.
Mhm.
And in many charts, what I see is that the full manifesting generator doesn't come in till 3 months.
Right.
The spiritual comes in a week before birth.
Mhm.
And that's when the baby usually drops. And that's when spirit becomes activated at whatever level we can say it's activated. There's a sort of the way I think of it is, even though a baby doesn't think,
Mhm.
something profound is happening in utero.
Yeah.
And that shift a week before birth is, I don't know what the hormones exactly are, but there's a major shift that affects the spirit in that time frame. And then 2 days before, the woman's physiology is shifting to get ready for delivery.
Mhm.
In many instances, the baby is already in the birth canal, or there's Braxton Hicks contractions, but there's chemical changes happening at each of these periods. The hour and a half before birth, which is a lunar calculation, not a solar, is transition in labor. And it's really, when I was pregnant with my son, my first child, I wanted to be absolutely no anesthesia, no anything.
Mhm.
And I kept saying, well, if transition is the worst part of labor and it only lasts for an hour to an hour and a half, why do we use drugs? It's such a short period of time. Um, so I didn't do any drugs during my deliveries. And I was in labor for 6.5 hours with my son. And I remember once I got into transition, looking at the clock and thinking, I can't do this much longer. And as soon as I thought that, the doctor said, we're going into the delivery room.
Mm.
Uh, and it was such an unbelievably orgasmic experience to have natural childbirth,
Mhm.
no anesthesia whatsoever. That while I was on the table, I said to my then husband, let's do this right away. This is great.
Mhm.
And we did.
Mhm.
My daughter was born 11 months later.
Yeah.
So the experience of childbirth was a spiritual initiation that we've taken away from women. Very unnecessary to take it away from women. And babies, to drug the babies. What are we doing to their soul? So those prenatal calculations are showing us, ideally, who this baby is designed to be.
Mhm.
And the postnatal mark very critical developmental times in early baby development. And as a psychologist and working with MDs, and Marvin is an MD, those periods are very critical periods in early development.
Mhm.
At an hour and a half after delivery, the baby's breathing on its own.
Mhm.
We know if there's a problem, if the baby can't breathe on its own. 2 days after, there's full attachment between mother and baby. The colostrum turns to milk, and there's attachment. And I remember with my son, um, and I've told this before, when I was pregnant with Charles, I had gained 12 pounds total.
Wow.
So I wasn't drugged. And after he was born, I looked at my body and it was back to my pre-pregnancy body. My stomach was flat. I weighed less than when I got pregnant. And I'm thinking, okay, this is my child. You
Mhm.
know, this baby's my baby.
Mhm.
And I was okay, so I remember the pain, I remember the delivery. So I'm supposed to feel something.
Wow.
And I'm looking to see, what do I feel for this baby? And then I stood up and went to wash my hands and I crinkle my forehead. And I had noticed Charles crinkling his forehead.
Aw.
And I felt the hormones. It was like this whoosh. And that did it. I was attached.
Mm.
And there was, I would have broken down the nursery door if my baby was crying.
Yeah.
It was a physiologic connection between that baby and me.
Mhm.
And a week after birth, in many cultures, is when they name the baby
Mhm.
because they feel that the soul is then anchored. And, think back to olden times when childbirth wasn't so safe and they didn't know if the baby would live.
Right. Right.
So in many cultures, they don't name the baby for a week.
Right.
And then there's a ceremony, and the baby's here to stay.
Mhm.
And then we watch the baby develop. And 3 months after birth, the baby reaches for objects and has preferences.
Mhm.
So I disagree with Ra.
Mhm.
We do have choice,
Right.
v- validated in developmental and physiologic psychology.
Mhm.
That at 3 months of age, a baby is interacting. They're no longer considered a neonate. They are now considered an infant, and they have preferences. They prefer certain people, they prefer certain toys, they prefer certain sleeping positions. They're beginning to identify who they are. And so when I'm looking at a chart, I'm looking at the timing
Mhm.
of which world came in when
Yep.
and which aspects of the world are were and are informing the psyche of the person whose chart we're looking at.
Yep.
Does that answer it for you?
It does beautifully. There's a lot of as you were talking about the week before birth, I was getting this image of like an astronaut preparing in the shuttle for launch, like some version of getting ready for the roller coaster ride. They're strapping in, like whatever version of that is. I'm curious about the
That brings up something that I just want to
please.
state for the record. What you're bringing up is the amount of physiologic stress that a baby is under in that week before birth is possibly why, once we're born, we have anxiety about expressing our deep self.
Well, powerful being that you are, I was double breach.
Oh,
And we started talking about this on some message forum. In my 40s, I got, for me, verification that I was a twin birth. So
hmm.
my mom was originally pregnant, and there's twins in our genetic, my maternal side. And the doctor would say, "Are you sure you're not having twins?" And for whatever reason, it didn't like verify. And I've always had this experience. There's a continuation of storyline around abandonment. I don't need to go into that necessarily. I'm happy to, but just for time's sake. And so I always felt this like longing for this twin who didn't stay. And I've done a number of experiences around uh, connecting with him. Like his soul is more advanced than my biological father was. And so I was so
Mm.
fixated before understanding this about being a twin birth. I was so fixated on why my biological dad, couldn't connect with me or, wasn't available. Because interesting also to the dynamics that you're speaking about of pre-pregnancy. You said in some conversation, I think with Sean, about learn everything you can, get all the data. Maybe it was with Now. It was with Now. And I did I inventoried, I asked, and she said, before I was born, your father was like, we're gonna have this many, and it's gonna be, and so it was very excited and celebratory, because otherwise my mom was isolated. She, in choosing this marriage, had caused a rift in her close family connections. And so she was kind of ride or dying with my biological father, and he's communicating, we've got this. And then I'm born, and my being had to be quiet. So I can talk about more reasons, but there was a very clear disconnect of in utero with a sibling who didn't stay and out of utero, like this isn't what they promised. Like I can
Hmm.
connect to the experience of like I get to be a person again and this is going to be amazing and let's go do this. And then I'm like, fuck, this is not what they promised. And so that disconnect of what was the reality of my childhood, everybody did the best they could. This isn't shaming on anybody. And it was a disconnect. And so I, before knowing these other details, I would think about like I was cannonballing, like, I don't want to come out. And my mom is, I think, physically similar to you. And it wasn't pleasant, this cannonball experience of my physicality coming out. So there's a lot of dot connections that's really
When
interesting.
when did your twin leave? Do you know?
I don't. I don't. Yeah, that's not a question that I've gotten to. But it's interesting, we've talked previously about, Osho and being a sannyasin. So Nameh came through a song. I knew I wanted to live more from my spiritual self. And I don't know if your brain can do this, but can you say, yeah, can you say Nameh backwards?
He-Men?
He-Man. Do you remember that cartoon, Master of the Universe? So that's how I think of my twin, that he's up
Ah,
there. Because what had come through in some guidance in a reading was that he gave everything to me. He gave his life force to me. And because I was in this kind of like, but you're leaving me here alone. And he's like, let's reframe that. I've given you all of my juice. This life is for you. We'll do more later. So,
from what I've heard, um, in near-death experiences, and actually, I listened to one about a boy yesterday
yeah.
who died in a car accident, 7 years old. And when he went into heaven, he saw two siblings who his he had never been told about. And so they were watching over him.
Hmm.
They were miscarriages. So clearly your brother is present.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, is your dad still alive?
Mm-mm. No, do you know about family constellations? That
Mhm.
So I've done a number of constellations. My first constellation was with him, and that's part of how I got all of this information. So I don't know how much you're curious about, so stop me if you're like, nah, may too much. Um, but my mom uh was in an orphanage from age
Mm.
2 to 8 because my grandmother was a single parent. So she had a 2-year-old once my um, grandfather and her separated. And so she needed somebody to take care of the children and decided that the orphanage was the place to go. Um, that same orphanage was also where my biological father was at. So there's a 10-year difference. And this is Chicago, actually. You and I having this connection with Chicago. But what I learned in preparing for the family constellation was that my father's mother left him, so divorced, when he was 10 years old. My dad, my biological father, was deceased. That's when I met him. When I was 9 years old, I met him at the funeral. So my parents divorced when I was 3, and then age 9, that's when I physically met my dad. But through that constellation, the people who stood in and played, I don't like played, but channeled the experience of that grandmother and my biological father said, the grandmother took ownership and said, it was my responsibility. I didn't teach him how to love. So from age 10 on, he didn't get that learning. And I think another detail around um, the um, the reason why there was such a disconnect when I was physically born. So my father, which I learned at the funeral, was married 3 times. My mom was the middle marriage, but in the first marriage, he had 2 children that were born. One of them died of crib death.
Ooh.
And the other one, and this was, so I was born in 73. So you can imagine this is late 60s or early 70s. I don't exactly know. But the other sibling, so my biological half brother, had some sort of experience that they put him on medication.
Mm.
So my dad, my biological dad, is learning how to medicate. So he did this with his children. Like, I can't imagine crib death as a parent. And so who knows where my dad was at that first marriage, and then his child, and then the second child. So it all kind of feeds on itself for why my joy is like this joyful me has always been here. And for my father, it was too much. It triggered, it did all of those things. So his young soul, not having that evolution, not having the biological mother, and then being in an orphanage, like he had a rough go of it.
Very rough.
Yeah. So those are my answering your questions. Yeah.
Uh, so your brother obviously came in to protect you.
Ah, it's so wow. There's something really to that. My
Do you think he was the reincarnation of the crib death?
I've never thought about that. Oh, I don't know. I don't know. So the thing that wants to be said, and I realize we're saying a lot of traumatic things. The So there's a lot of have these beings or don't have these beings. Yeah.
Mm.
So there's a lot contributing to all of these layers. And so when you put that in with the chart, right? There, yeah. I don't know. It looks like you were going somewhere.
Um, I'm thinking about what you said about your concern about sharing the truth, um, and how that relates to all of this birth stuff. And also, I think do we know anything about the generation before your grandparents?
Yeah. So again, family constellations. Um, so if you've seen those containers, how the person who steps into a role is channeling another person, their body position is really important. And so when this dynamic was happening with my grandmother and my father, I, the person who was representing me was kneeling. My biological mother was kneeling. My grandmother was kneeling. And so was my great grandmother because my great grandmother's father hated women.
Oh,
And there was a really violent experience that I don't need to describe, but didn't. So this was the lineage who came over from Poland. And, I don't know if that relates to anything, but they probably had a rough go of it. So my great grandmother didn't have a
what
positive,
religion were they?
I think Catholic, but because they would always do the rosary, that sort of thing. And my grandma found it really important to light the candles, all of that. And do you know Angel Guardian?
Mm-mm.
That was the orphanage. It's like Devon and Ridge. Anyway, kind of north side. Yeah. Um, but so, great grandmother who left my father when he was 10, and then all of these women, my side, was kneeling because of this energy of that great great grandfather. And so she comes over here and was like, get out. And she changed the dynamic, and we all stood.
Mm.
This piece about naming or being able to speak the truth, there was violence that said no. There's past life lineage. So there's genetic lineage and there's soul lineage. Because I don't know if you've done that. To me, I feel like those are kind of distinct categories, genetic lineage and soul lineage.
Are you free of them?
Good question. So what's here to say is I'm getting freer. Um, yeah, that's something for me to keep going with. Because I feel a sense of wanting their permission, and I feel a sense of I have to live up to all of these maternal experiences who had the ceilings, they couldn't crack or go beyond. I mean, they did some epic things, but I was very clear I'm not going to have children unless I'm with somebody who's going to be able to hold that container. So, yeah. Thank you for that question.
Um, there's some unraveling that I think needs to be done in um, releasing
Mm.
the regrets that the ancestors had.
Mhm.
Not your regrets,
Right.
but their regrets.
Well, I was also feeling as you were saying that forgiving those beings who were connected to the violence in the ways or the oppression or in some ways I don't mean this as a excuse, but it was the time that they were living in. It was the capacity that they were in. Yeah.
Well, they were also in Chicago.
Can you say more?
Um, Chicago was a violent city.
Oh.
It was, um, when I was there at University of Chicago, um, Hyde Park was okay, the Loop was okay, but you didn't go anywhere else.
Yeah.
Um, it's never been a really safe city because it's been very divisive
Mhm.
in its racism.
Mhm.
And before I was even there, we had crime syndicates in Chicago,
Mhm.
and the politics were always corrupt.
Right.
So you're dealing with a mental world
Mhm.
that had no undercurrent of support for spirituality or kindness. And the element of fear
Mhm.
was very prominent
Mhm.
in the city.
Yeah.
Uh, so if, I mean, I remember sitting, I moved, I went to a conference, a Jungian conference in California, in Malibu, in August of 1976. And when I got back to Chicago, I remember sitting one evening and thinking, I have to move because everything I have spiritually in Chicago, I had to create.
Mm.
There was no spiritual support energetically in that city.
Wow. That's really landing something. I'm so grateful you said that. Because I felt, I mean, how did I move to Santa Fe? 2016 Uranus opposition, all the tethers, my grandmother, who was like a second parent, her passing. Yeah, yeah. I definitely felt that. Yeah,
So, you have to add that into the mix.
right.
That if you're not getting, and it may also factor into why you are reluctant when you're facing opposition to own your spirituality
Mhm.
because the environment did not support it. And I know that it's not the people
Mm,
and it's not anything tangible,
mm,
it's energetic.
mm,
Uh, I had created a very good life in Chicago.
mhm.
My office was 180 North Michigan Avenue overlooking the lake. I
Yep.
lived on the near north side. I had a practice with a 6 month waiting list. I
Mhm,
had just published a book on
mhm,
divorce and relationships. And I'm sitting there one night thinking, other than what I've created, I have no spiritual support. I can't live here anymore. So, how much responsibility you take for living in a spiritual frequency when you have no support around you, it's significant.
yeah. Yeah. I, yeah. I think you know this that I was a farmer for 10 years, and that was my first kind of deepening of how the earth or my connection to the planet, we've talked about that, but if I walked her around where I'm living, I create these hubs of mystical anchoring with me so that I built a fairy garden. I
Oh,
crocheted
nice.
a fairy garden. I crocheted them a little a couch, and then a little swing. Anyway, it delights me, and it's this synergistic back and forth. And yeah, I look at the Santa Fe Mountains, and if I can't create that nestle of nourishment, there's only so far I can go. Yeah.
And your mom's still alive?
Mhm.
What nourishes her?
I don't know. I don't know.
Could you ask her?
I could. I could.
And why don't you ask her if she had it to do over again? Would she do it the same way or differently? And if different, what would she do different?
Wow. Beautiful.
Clean question.
Mhm.
Um, I think if she can forgive herself uh, for what she thinks she did wrong for you,
Mm,
then that will release you.
mm, mm, mm. Yeah, it's been a lot of intentional work or exploration to not hold her responsible for my life.
Um, but if she still
Yeah.
feels responsible, you may not be able to fully release it.
Ah, I see. I see.
Because if you released it, you would lose the connection with her.
Hmm. That's something that I've explained, to other people around this abandonment theme, that for a longest time, I was holding on to the story of abandonment because I thought that was the only way to be connected to my biological father. And I deeply wanted to feel him. And then when it clicked that, oh, there's more we can do beyond this story, I can feel him up there in whatever capacity he can reach or connect. So, yeah, there's something really powerful with what you're
You could
pointing.
also dialogue with him
Mhm.
and um, let him know that you understand
Mhm.
that circumstances dictated to him more than his soul.
Mhm.
And that may break his impasse.
Mhm. Wow.
If you put yourself in his shoes,
Mhm.
what would he want?
Right. Right. Yeah, there's some ways your questions are like coloring the image more, giving it more complexity and beauty. Thank you.
And then I think a empowering exercise
Hmm.
might be to consider what gifts you got from your father.
I know. I was feeling that, wondering what I would say. I don't know. Like I knew him from age 0 to 3. Like I don't know.
What did he do for work?
He was a manager of a Pizza Hut.
Hmm. And was he capable of more?
I'll have to talk with him. I don't have, I have the lens of my grandmother's version of him, my mother's version of him. I don't have my own, or not yet. So I don't know. I just know the storyline of where maybe life stunted him. I can't imagine living in an orphanage from age 10 to however, and then coming back out of that because the orphanage wasn't loving.
Hmm. But a lot of times in an orphanage, it's the peer relationships that save the soul.
Hmm.
So there must have been something your mom saw in him that was valuable enough that she married him.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think he was very charismatic, for sure. They didn't actually know each other. It was just that they had that common equation. So, yeah.
Um, ask your mom about him.
Yeah.
Get as much from her as you can.
Yeah. Yeah.
It may clear things for her
Hmm.
if you ask the questions in the right way.
Yeah. I'd love to hear her tell me like how she fell in love with him. Because I think to what you're pointing to, she might stop some of that because she believes maybe she made the wrong choice, or, because we had a hard go of it. So,
Well, you could start out by saying to her, Mom, I've been really thinking about it, and I'm so glad
yeah.
that you and Dad connected because otherwise I wouldn't exist.
Yeah.
And so I'd love to know what the good parts of him were
Yeah.
that attracted you.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And how beautiful would it be to get rid of that orphanage experience
Yeah.
and move beyond it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because, it was a container
Hmm.
that kept them safe.
Right. Right.
And as a parent, you can't ever do it right for your kids.
Mhm.
No matter how good you do it, you can't do it right.
Right. Yeah.
I'm not in 100%. I mean,
Mhm.
I've said to my kids, if I had it to do over again, what would you want me to do differently? And they say, well, you were a great parent. It's not satisfying. I know with my daughter that when I moved to California, it was traumatic for her.
Mm.
Um, and she would have preferred I stayed in Chicago. Had I stayed in Chicago, it would have been detrimental, not just to me, but to her and her brother. But she doesn't really know that.
Right.
Um, but I think certainly if your mother's alive, she's a storehouse of information for you.
For sure. For sure.
So I would get her talking.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Thank
would ask, I'm the youngest of five,
Mm.
and growing up, I would sit for hours in the kitchen with my mom,
Mm.
and I'd say, tell me about when you were five.
Mm.
Tell me about when you were 10. I would, for whatever reason, I was a psychologist when I was a kid, looking for longitudinal data.
Mhm.
And I would even say to my mother, so Ma, what was it like when you and Daddy first got together? What was sex like for you?
Mm.
And when my siblings would hear me ask that question, they go, how can you ask her that? I want to know. So, and what was interesting was there were stories that some of my older siblings told me,
Mm.
and I heard them one way because of the way they told it.
Right.
But as I backed away from it and realized it was somebody interpreting what somebody else said, I reframed it
Mm.
because some of the stories I heard were pretty hurtful.
Mhm.
And so I took them in and I thought, wait a minute, this is going through this person's filter.
Right.
What if it went without a filter?
Mhm.
What could the other messages have been?
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of room for you to get a lot of really good info in the four worlds.
Yeah. 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 Uh, I'm so grateful that we meandered here together. Thank you. Such a
It's
good.
fun.
Yeah, yeah, I'm thrilled you wanted to do this. There was something you brought through in a class that was about, I guess, how I heard it was safety around being intuitive. And her digestion or making sense of that experience, she was like, I just need to squash. I can't be psychic. I can't be. But when she talks about it, she doesn't talk about it from a place of appreciation or celebration or delight. So, in our conversation today, it feels like you're naming this theme of you can't speak the truth. So, I could see that being a version of being clouding her experience, but also as a 10-year-old, she didn't know what to do with it. And there was nobody just.
Um, but that speaks also to you feeling anxiety when you speak from a psychic place.
Yes, yes.
So I think it would be of benefit for you to share with her that psychic abilities can be trained and that she knows more than she admits to knowing, and always did. And maybe some of the holding back in her life that she's done
Mm.
has come from not allowing her full self to bloom.
Mhm.
And to talk to her possibly about how important it is with psychic ability to, well, I know it's important to train it. I
Mm.
know it's important to use it responsibly.
Mhm.
And to not be afraid of it.
Yeah.
Does she know that you're a psychic? No?
I don't know. Because for a while, I don't know if you know this about my trajectory, but I was studying to be a death doula. I wanted to open a center to help support people in their dying process. Because I was curious actually to ask you this when you were talking about a little digression, when you were talking about birthing and how, not wanting to have drugs, did it feel like it was a portal similar to what witnessing or being in the space when somebody's in their death portal?
I didn't think about it like that.
Okay.
Um, my sister, my niece, my first niece, was born when I was 11.
Mm.
So I remember sitting with my sister when she was pregnant
Mm.
because she lived in the downstairs apartment and we lived in an upstairs apartment. And I remember saying, why do women put so much emphasis on giving birth, which takes,
Ah.
a few hours when the pregnancy has taken 9 months?
Mhm.
And why do you wipe out the physical experience of that? Shouldn't we move through it so that it becomes part of the pregnancy?
Mm.
Um, and I couldn't really understand
Mm.
that blocking out of the delivery process. It was like there was something wrong with that,
Mhm.
that women wouldn't actually experience giving birth.
Mhm.
Um, so now my oldest sister, was terrified of her psychic experiences.
Mm.
But my older brother, who was 16 years older than me, was a communist,
Mm.
a card carrying, bona fide college communist. And when I was 11, he went off to China undercover.
Mm.
And then when I was about 13, the FBI came looking for him.
Mm.
So I had these experiences of, wait a minute. And my oldest sister knew the day he was coming home.
Mm.
And he was like incognito for a year or two. I don't
Right.
know how long. One day he disappeared and nobody told anybody where he went because they didn't know. And then one day she said, Harvey's coming home. And the phone rang and he said, I'm at Grand Central.
Yeah.
And she was hysterical.
Mm.
It was like, where did this come from? Get me out of here.
Yeah.
So when I started having my psychic experiences, I wasn't afraid. But when I was seeing more than I wanted to see,
Uh-huh.
like that a person was going to die in 24 hours who I didn't know, I knew I needed to learn how to control it.
Mhm.
So it can be controlled.
Mhm.
I can see or not see now
Mhm.
at will.
That's an idea.
I mean, I had some of that with my sister. And
Mm.
she finally said to me, all that stuff you've been talking about, it's real, isn't it? Mhm.
Mhm.
She, would you give me a reading list?
Mm,
Before she died, I gave about 5, 6 years before she died, I gave her a reading list.
got
And
it.
she read the book. I actually sent her the books.
Yeah,
I figured she wouldn't follow through on a reading list, but I sent her the books.
got it. Got it.
Things like Initiation
Hmm.
by Elizabeth H.,
Okay.
where she talks about a past life in Egypt
Hmm.
and how, because she wanted the initiation prematurely and she wasn't ready, she
Hmm.
had to come back and do it again
Hmm.
and evolve.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh, but there are quite a few esoteric novels um, that might open the door.
Hmm. Thank you.
I loved reading some of them. Marie Corelli, written around the turn of the century, and Brother of the Third Degree, which was the point I got out of that book was when you've made the right choice,
Hmm.
each step of the way in your life, then you have to trust you're going in the right direction, in the right way, in the right space.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
And
It,
sometimes you don't know.
well, and as you're naming that, I'm hearing, when you know what no one can tell you different. That feels similar energy.
It is similar energy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, sweetheart, I want to honor your time.
Okay. I think it's time to stop.
I agree. Thank you, sweetheart. Thank you, thank you, thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you.
Yes.
This has been fun.
Oh, good. Good, good.